I am Cassandra Whitmore, a 31 years old. I live in a small apartment just outside Fairview, South Carolina, and last year I survived stage 3 breast cancer. What happened with my sister when I needed her most nearly finished me off for good, but taking back what she stole, that changed everything. The last time I really believed Lydia loved me, I was lying in a recliner at the oncology clinic, the drip stand squeaking every time I shifted. The poison threaded through my veins at a pace that made me dizzy if I watched it too long. Lydia sat across from me, one leg crossed over the other like she was waiting for her nails to dry, scrolling through her phone while the nurse adjusted my IV. Back then I still believed her when she said, "Don't worry, Cass, I've got you." She'd say it without looking up, her thumb flicking a polished pink oval dancing across the glass. She always had me right. She was the older sister, the glamorous one, Dad's favorite, though he never said it out loud. Mom's mirror image. She was my first secret keeper, my first defender when the neighbor kids teased me about my name, my knock knees, my soft voice. So when the oncologist explained the treatment plan, 6 rounds of chemo, then surgery, then maybe more, Lydia didn't flinch. She just pressed her glossy lips together and said, "Cassie, I promise you fight. I'll handle the rest." The rest turned out to be every bill insurance didn't cover, every new drug the clinical trial required, every cost Dad's old union pension didn't stretch to meet. And when the social worker told me about the grant, the special fund for patients with no savings and no safety net, I'd cried so hard Lydia had to sign the paperwork for me. At the time, it felt like love, like family, like trust wrapped in a neat bow. My sister had my back. Or so I thought. I remember the day I found out what Lydia really did with that grant. It was one of those late winter afternoons when the sun tries to warm your skin, but the air still stings. I just got home from an appointment, my breath fogging the windshield as I sat in the car, too exhausted to climb the steps up to my second-floor walk-up. Jasper was waiting inside, my skinny tabby with his crooked tail and too loud purr, but even he wasn't enough motivation in that moment. I'd left my mail in the passenger seat. I grabbed it because I needed something to do with my hands, something to keep me from thinking about the scan results I wouldn't hear until next week. Most of it was junk, flyers for chain pizza joints I couldn't stomach anymore, a reminder about an overdue phone bill, and then an envelope from the charity that had given me the grant. I almost didn't open it right then. I almost saved it for after a nap, after a cup of tea, after something warm to anchor myself to, but I tore it open anyway. Dear Ms. Whitmore, this is a courtesy reminder that your recent grant disbursement was completed in full to the designated trustee as requested. Please retain this confirmation for your records. Should you require any follow-up care assistance, contact our office directly. The words didn't register at first. Designated trustee. The phrase looped in my brain like a glitch. I hadn't named a trustee. The only signature on that form was mine, or so I thought. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the letter between the seats. I called Lydia 3 times that night. No answer. I told myself she was busy, probably at one of her networking mixers with Brad, her husband, who loved to introduce himself as a wealth management consultant, while Lydia smiled beside him like a woman who'd never eaten boxed mac and cheese for dinner 4 nights in a row. When I finally reached her, she was annoyed. I could hear it, that clipped tone she used when she thought I was being dramatic. "Cassie, you're confused. I moved the money for you to keep it safe." Safe, that was the word she clung to, over and over. Safe, like my survival was a wad of cash in a sock drawer that she could lock up for a rainy day. When I asked her where the money went, she didn't even hesitate. "Into the down payment, obviously. The Mount Pleasant place. Don't worry, it's an investment. It's all in the family." The way she said "obviously" nearly broke me, like I was the unreasonable one for expecting the cancer money to go to my cancer. I hung up on her that night and didn't sleep. I lay in bed with Jasper curled into my hip, my phone screen burning holes in my vision as I reread the email confirmation from the charity. The next morning, I called them. A woman named Gloria answered. Her voice was soft but brittle, the tone of someone who delivered bad news all day long. Yes, the funds had been transferred. Yes, Lydia's name was on the paperwork as my trustee. Didn't I remember signing the authorization? Didn't I remember that clause? I did, or I thought I did. Lydia had handled that part. Lydia, with her carefully clipped nails and her endless patience for my confusion when the chemo fog made numbers swim. By the time I hung up with Gloria, my ears buzzed like someone had jammed a live wire under my skin. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, the half-drunk mug of tea going cold at my elbow while Jasper pawed at my leg, hungry and insistent. I felt paralyzed by my own trust. Every memory of Lydia holding my hand during blood draws, driving me home from appointments, reminding me to eat when my stomach rebelled. All of it curdled in the pit of my stomach. I called Tanya that night. We hadn't spoken in a few months, not since she left the firm where she'd once been Lydia's colleague. When I told her what happened, she went silent for so long I thought the line had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat. "You know what you have to do, Cass." But I didn't, not really. I was still that good sister. The baby sister who clung to family because Dad was gone now and Mom's ashes sat on Lydia's mantle in an urn I'd never seen because I was too sick to travel to the memorial. Tanya drove over the next day. She didn't come empty-handed. She brought a paper bag stuffed with old takeout containers she'd scrubbed clean, her way of reminding me to eat. She spread her files out on my kitchen table, pushing aside my hospital bills and half-empty prescription bottles. "First we prove it," she said, "then we fight." Proving it meant paperwork. Late nights squinting at scanned documents, my initials forged next to Lydia's neat cursive signature. Long phone calls with the charity's legal department, who suddenly sounded a lot less friendly once Tanya started using words like misappropriation and fraud. Meanwhile, Lydia kept calling. She left voicemails dripping with concern. "Cass, this isn't you. Let's not make a scene. I can explain everything." But she never did. She always sounded tired, like I was the problem, like I had thrown the first stone. Sometimes, when the exhaustion got too deep to climb out of, I'd sit in the dark and wonder what Dad would say if he were still here. He'd probably try to broker peace, he always did. The peacemaker. The man who patched Lydia's scraped knees and my split lip when the neighbor's swing set betrayed me at age 6. But Dad was gone, Lydia was a stranger. And I had Tanya, the only person who looked at me like I was still worth fighting for. One night, when we were both too tired to keep going, Tanya leaned across my sticky kitchen table and grabbed my hand. Her fingers were cold, her nails bitten short. "You're not just a victim, Cass," she said. "You're not just sick, you're not just your sister's problem, you're stronger than this." I wanted to believe her, I really did. The first time I stood outside Lydia's Mount Pleasant house, my house, paid for with my chance at survival, I nearly turned back. The porch light was on. Brad's Range Rover was parked in the driveway, polished to a mirror shine under the street lamp. I could see shadows moving behind the gauzy curtains. Lydia, probably fussing with throw pillows or rearranging the fake hydrangeas she bragged about on Facebook. I didn't ring the bell that night. I didn't throw a rock through the window. I just stood there, my breath fogging the air, Jasper's cat carrier clutched in my other hand because I'd brought him for comfort. I whispered into his fur, "She doesn't get to keep it. Not the house, not my future, not me." When I finally turned away and walked back to my car, the cold air bit through my scarf, but for once I didn't shiver. The fear was there, but underneath it something else flickered to life. Small, sharp, dangerous. A promise. The last thing I did before crawling into bed that night was tape Lydia's foreclosure notice to my refrigerator door. Tanya had printed it off at her office, the edges still warm from the copier. I smoothed it flat with shaking hands and stuck it up with a single magnet shaped like a cartoon orange, a leftover from some long-forgotten fridge at Dad's old house. It looked absurd next to my unpaid utility bills and the pale pink reminder card for my next oncology appointment. But every time I shuffled past that fridge, water at 3 a.m., leftover soup at dawn, I'd see Lydia's neat little kingdom perched on the brink of collapse. And for once, it wouldn't be my ruin paying for her shine. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork and gut punches. Tanya all but moved in, her laptop perched on my wobbly kitchen table between a tangle of charger cords and unpaid bills. The place smelled like stale coffee and Jasper's fur. He'd taken to sleeping on Tanya's backpack as though guarding the only person other than me who still gave a damn. Every day, Tanya printed something new: mortgage statements, charity disbursement records, copies of my forged signature on forms Lydia had probably signed at her marble breakfast bar while Brad looked on, nodding his oily approval. Sometimes I'd catch Tanya staring at me over the glow of her laptop. She never said it out loud that she couldn't believe I'd been so trusting, so blind. But I heard it anyway. I'd feel the words like grit in my mouth. I was the baby sister. I wanted to believe family still meant something, even when your body was betraying you cell by cell. But cancer was honest at least, it didn't pretend to love you first. One afternoon, when the sun slipped behind the skeletal oaks outside my kitchen window, Tanya shoved her laptop away and reached across the cluttered table. Her fingers brushed my knuckles, cold, always cold from too many hours hammering at a keyboard. "You need to see it for yourself, Cass." "See what?" I asked, though I knew I'd known for weeks. The house, the living monument to every secret Lydia had signed my name to. We drove out the next morning, Tanya behind the wheel, her fingers drumming the steering wheel to keep herself awake. She slept maybe 2 hours on my couch. I'd barely closed my eyes at all. Jasper watched us leave through the living room window, his tail flicking at the glass like he knew I wasn't ready to come home yet. The drive to Mount Pleasant felt like moving through molasses, sun rising in a slate sky, mist drifting across the highway, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt filling the silence we didn't dare break. Tanya's phone buzzed once, Elliot probably with another update about Lydia's lawyer spinning circles. When we pulled up in front of Lydia's house, my breath caught. Even from the curb it was absurd. The slate gray siding, the polished brass numbers gleaming under the porch light Lydia probably left on 24/7 to ward off reality. The Range Rover was there, parked at an angle like Brad had just slammed it into park after another late-night meeting that wasn't really a meeting. Tanya killed the engine but didn't move. She just watched me, her eyes soft but unflinching. "Ready." I nodded, though I'd never be ready. There was no dramatic confrontation. No Lydia sweeping open the door in a silk robe, shrieking that I was trespassing. The house was empty when the bank's locksmith let us in, just silence, and the distant hum of a smart fridge I knew probably cost more than my entire treatment plan. I stepped over the threshold, my sneakers squeaking against polished tile. Tanya hovered near the door, letting me lead. It was like stepping into a dream stitched together from every lie I'd believed. The gleaming kitchen island, the deep farmhouse sink Lydia bragged about on Instagram, the carefully staged bookshelves lined with hardcovers she never read. I ran my fingers along the marble counter. Cold, smooth, paid for with poison that still lived under my skin. I could almost see Lydia here, barefoot, glass of imported wine in hand, telling her followers how blessed she was, how hard she and Brad had worked to earn this dream life. I moved from room to room, touching things I'd never wanted but couldn't stop craving. The clawfoot tub she posed beside in her bathrobe. The walk-in closet with rows of color-coded blouses and shoes lined up like soldiers. A life curated from the bones she picked off me. In the living room, I found the family photo, the one that made my throat tighten more than any marble counter ever could. Lydia and me, maybe 15 and 17, Dad behind us with his big carpenter's hands draped over our shoulders like a benediction. Mom smiling, soft and tired, her hair pulled back in the same loose ponytail I'd started wearing when mine began to grow back in stubborn tufts. I sat on the edge of Lydia's spotless white couch, that photo frame heavy in my hands. Tanya sat on the floor beside my knees. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. When we left, I set the photo right back where I'd found it, on the shelf behind the staged orchid arrangement. I didn't want it. That moment in time was gone, buried in a shoebox of other memories Lydia had hollowed out with her pretty smiles and her forged promises. On the drive back, Tanya kept her eyes on the road while I stared out at the blur of trees. I wondered if Lydia was watching us from somewhere, behind a curtain in a cheap hotel, or from the window of a friend's spare bedroom where she was spinning her next lie. Did she even care anymore? Or was she too busy rehearsing a new version of the story where she was the victim all along? The foreclosure hearing came 3 weeks later. Elliot wore the same tired suit he'd worn to Dad's funeral, or maybe it just looked the same, gray and rumpled and honest in a way that felt comforting. Lydia didn't show. Brad did, his expensive haircut failing to hide the twitch under his eye every time Elliot said fraud loud enough for the court reporter to catch it. I sat behind Elliot, Tanya beside me. I could feel her knee pressed against mine, a silent anchor whenever my stomach threatened to revolt. The judge never looked at me once. He didn't have to. The paperwork spoke for itself: forged signatures, stolen funds, a marble palace built on a dying sister's name. When the gavel fell, it didn't feel like victory, just gravity, a promise kept. The house would be sold, the charity repaid, The rest, the leftover scraps of my stolen chance, would come back to me. I didn't go to the house again. I didn't need to. Instead, I sat in my apartment surrounded by packing boxes I hadn't decided what to do with yet. Tanya found me curled up in the nest of my second-hand couch, Jasper perched on my lap, his tail flicking over the final check from the bank. She sat beside me, shoulder to shoulder, our foreheads almost touching when she leaned in. "So," she said, "what do you want now, Cass?" It was such a simple question, but my answer caught in my throat, because I didn't know. I'd spent so long clawing my future back from Lydia's grip that I hadn't dared to imagine what came next. We made coffee and let Jasper knock mugs off the table. We laughed about it until the tears slipped free, mine, not Tanya's. She was my anchor, she always would be. Later, when she'd finally drifted off on my lumpy couch, I lay awake on the floor beside Jasper's warm weight and whispered the truth into the dark. I wanted a life that couldn't be stolen, a roof that didn't cost me my peace, a door Lydia would never stand behind again. I wanted to remember my father's voice without tasting bile. I wanted my mother's ashes to belong to me too, not to the marble palace that never loved me back. I wanted a home. That night I started to believe I could have it, not because Lydia lost, but because, finally, I had stopped giving her the pieces of myself she never deserved. Ripped apart. The next morning the sun slipped through the torn edge of my blinds and landed right across my face like a dare. I lay there for a while, counting Jasper's breaths where he curled on my hip, his purr a soft, stubborn rumble that reminded me I was still here, still breathing, still mine. Tanya was already up. I could hear her humming in the kitchen, the faint clink of my only clean mug against the chipped counter. She didn't ask if I wanted coffee. She just made it strong, cheap, the way we both liked it. When I padded out to join her, she slid the mug across the table like she was handing over something fragile that might shatter if she held it too long. She looked exhausted, hair pulled into a messy knot, dark circles carved under her eyes. But her smile was bright, clean, like hope I hadn't dared to touch yet. "So," she said, voice soft as steam rising from the mug, "today's the day." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She knew. We talked about it in snippets between emails and court filings, half-formed dreams spoken into the air at 2 in the morning when it felt safer to pretend they might never come true. Today I was going to look for my own place. Not a marble palace. Not a house with granite counters and fake hydrangeas and a Range Rover in the driveway. Just mine. 4 walls that didn't carry the taste of betrayal in every polished corner. It felt like a betrayal in its own small way, to want something so normal when so much of me still felt raw and exposed. But I'd spent too long living in rooms that never felt safe, always waiting for the next call from them, the next pink slip from the hospital, the next knock on the door I was afraid would see Lydia come to distant out of my life. Now there was money in my account and money, not stolen scraps dressed up in silk and credit cards, not hush money disguised as investment. Just what was left after the charity was repaid, the lawyers were fed, the lies that carved off the bones of my life. Enough to buy a little piece of the world that would never belong to Lydia. The realtor's office smelled like stale carpet cleaner and burnt coffee. The man they sent Mark, in a suit that didn't quite fit, kept glancing at me like he was waiting for me to change my mind. Maybe he'd Googled me. Maybe he'd read the article Holly had written, the one that lived online like a bruise I couldn't cover with makeup or polite smiles. He cleared his throat so often, I almost offered him one of the cough drops buried in the bottom of my bag. It's small," he said when we pulled up in front of the third listing that day. He said it like an apology, like he thought I wanted Lydia's palace in miniature. He didn't understand that marble made me sick now, that granite tasted like iron on my tongue. The house was small. He wasn't lying. White siding cracked in places where the last owner had run out of money or patience. A crooked porch that dipped near the steps, shutters missing a slat, but the yard, God, the yard, wild roses gone feral along the fence line, a skinny tree in the corner that looked half dead but refused to fall over. Tanya squeezed my hand so tight my knuckles popped. Mark fumbled with the keys, the lock protesting like it hadn't been turned in years. The door swung inward and the smell hit me first, dust, dry wood, a hint of something green where the wild roses had clawed through a cracked window screen. No granite, no marble, no carefully staged orchid on the mantel. Just 4 rooms, a sagging ceiling in the back bedroom, and floors that creaked like they were sighing under the weight of my shadow. Perfect. Mark's voice floated in and out, square footage, water heater age, the faint echo of as is repeated like a warning. I let it wash over me while I traced my fingers along the chipped window frame, the paint flacking under my touch like old secrets giving up their hold. Mine, the word bloomed in my chest like something stubborn and green pushing through frostbitten soil. Mine. Back at the car, Tanya didn't ask. She didn't have to. She just pulled out her phone, snapping blurry pictures of the front porch, the wild roses tangled like a promise along the fence. "You're really doing this, huh?" she said, grinning so wide it made her look like the girl I'd met in college. The girl who'd once promised we'd grow old together in side-by-side rocking chairs, cackling at everyone who'd underestimated us. I laughed, the sound cracking in my throat. I think I am. The closing happened fast, faster than Tanya or Mark expected. Maybe because the seller was desperate, maybe because the universe owed me one small mercy after all the rest it had stripped away. 2 weeks later, I stood on the sagging porch with the keys digging into my palm, the metal warm from where I'd clutched it the entire drive over. Tanya snapped a photo of me there, hair wild from the wind, Jasper peeking out from his carrier at my feet like he was judging my taste. The sign out front read "Sold" in faded red letters. I almost asked Tanya to take it down for me, but then I left it there. Proof maybe that it was really over, that something else was starting. Inside, the first thing I did was open every window. I let the late spring air sweep through, dragging out the stale ghosts, the dust motes dancing like they were grateful for the light. Jasper slinked from room to room, tail high, inspecting corners like he'd appointed himself caretaker of this battered, beautiful wreck I'd staked my future on. I stood in the middle of the empty living room, floors bare, walls cracked, a single beam of sunlight painting the floorboards like gold leaf. I pressed my palm flat against the nearest wall and whispered, "Mine." It didn't echo, it settled. That first night, Tanya refused to leave me alone. She dragged over an old air mattress she found in her basement, the plastic squeaking every time we shifted. We ate cheap takeout pizza on the floor, Jasper nosing the crusts like he couldn't believe we'd invited him to the feast. The only light came from a single strand of fairy lights Tanya plugged in near the front window, leftover from a birthday party that felt like a lifetime ago. Outside, the yard whispered in the breeze, roses nodding their thorny heads against the fence like they were already planning where to grow next. We didn't talk about Lydia that night. We didn't talk about the Marble Palace or the charity's emails or Brad's oily smirk when the foreclosure was finalized. We didn't talk about the next oncology scan or the pills lined up like little sentinels in my bathroom back at the apartment. We just sat there, full-bellied and warm, 2 women who'd survived the worst of each other's storms. When Tanya finally fell asleep, her breath soft and steady beside me, Jasper crawled onto my chest and purred until I felt the tight knot in my ribs start to loosen. I watched the fairy lights flicker and listened to the house settle, the soft groan of old beams, the sigh of loose siding in the wind. It wasn't much. To anyone else, maybe it was nothing, too small, too broken, too ordinary. But it was mine. Bought with my anger, paid for with my grief. Built on the scraps Lydia couldn't steal because she'd never understood what home really meant. I drifted off with Jasper's warmth tucked under my chin and the faint scent of wild roses drifting through the open windows. No polished granite, no staged perfection. Just the sharp sweetness of something alive and untamed growing where the rot used to be. Outside, the last petals trembled on the fence line, a promise that no matter how deep the winter cuts, spring always finds a way through. The first morning in my new house, I woke up stiff and a little cold on the squeaky air mattress, with Jasper's purr vibrating against my ribs like a reminder that I was alive, and not just alive, free. Tanya was already gone, her pillow dented and her half-drunk bottle of water tipped over on the floor. She left a note taped to my front door, coffee at 10. Don't chicken out. She knew me too well. Knew how easy it would be for me to sit in that half-empty living room and let the weeds grow back through my ribs instead of pulling myself up and facing what came next. I padded barefoot through my new place, the floor cool under my feet. There were cracks in the plaster above the windows. The baseboards needed scraping and paint. The old gas heater rattled every time I walked past it, like it was reminding me it could give up at any moment. But even with all its bruises, the place felt more honest than Lydia's palace ever had. The air smelled like fresh wood and wet roses drifting through the broken screen. I breathed it in and let it settle in my chest, heavy and sweet. No more marble floors, no more cold countertops paid for with stolen blood. Mine. I made instant coffee on the old camping stove Tanya had left behind. I didn't have a proper coffee maker yet. I drank it black, sitting cross-legged in the middle of my empty living room, Jasper batting at the spoon when I wasn't paying attention. He didn't care that the place was small or broken. To him, it was warm and open and full of windows to watch birds through. He'd already claimed it as his kingdom. Outside, the street was quiet. No Range Rover in the drive. No nosy neighbors asking where I'd been or what I'd done. Just an old mail carrier rolling by on squeaky wheels and a pair of kids on battered bikes racing up and down the cracked sidewalk. They didn't look twice at me through the window, and that felt like the first real blessing I'd had in a long time. By 10, Tanya banged on the door so loud Jasper jumped and skittered behind a stack of boxes. She was balancing 2 paper cups and a greasy bag that smelled like cheap donuts. "Day 1, she said, stepping over the threshold without waiting for an invite. "First official breakfast in Casa Whitmore, might as well ruin the floors with powdered sugar now." We ate on the floor again. Tanya perched on one of my moving boxes like a makeshift throne. She rattled off a list of things we'd need to fix first. The cracked porch step, the flickering bathroom light, the leaky faucet she'd spotted last night when she tried to brush her teeth and got sprayed instead. "You're gonna need a real plumber, Cass," she said through a mouthful of donut. "Not me with a roll of duct tape and YouTube tutorials. You got the money now, do it right." I flinched a little when she said money. It still didn't feel real, that there was enough in my account to pay for a plumber, a painter, maybe even a real couch that didn't smell like Jasper's fur and stale takeout. Every dollar felt like a tiny apology from the universe for the ways Lydia had carved me up and left me for dead. After breakfast, Tanya helped me haul boxes from the battered old car we'd borrowed from her neighbor. Half my stuff was in thrift store bins, chipped mugs, my mother's old Afghan that smelled faintly of cedar and age. I'd saved it from Lydia's basement the night I moved out for good, wrapped it around my shoulders like armor when the cold set in deeper than my bones. Jasper skulked around the boxes, sniffing every corner like a little general inspecting his troops. When he found Mom's blanket, he curled right up on top, tucking his paws under his chin like he'd known her too. Maybe, in his way, he had. By afternoon, Tanya's phone was blowing up with messages from Elliot, questions about the final escrow transfer, the leftover balance from the foreclosure, the last receipts from the charity's restitution. She handled it all from my front porch, packing back and forth in her scuffed sneakers, the wild roses brushing her arm every time she turned at the porch railing. I stood in the doorway and watched her work, her voice sharp but kind, her brow furrowed as she fought for every last piece of my freedom like it was hers too. Maybe it was. Tanya had lost as much as I had when Lydia's lies unraveled, her job at the firm, friends who chose Lydia's polished version of events over my messy truth. When she finally hung up, she leaned her hip against the railing and looked at me with that stubborn little tilt of her chin. "One last check," she said, "then it's really done." I wanted to believe her, wanted to feel the door slam shut behind me so hard Lydia couldn't pry it open again with some new version of her soft, poisonous voice. That night after Tanya left, I dragged Mom's Afghan to the porch and sat on the top step. Jasper settled at my feet, eyes half closed, tail flicking at the drifting petals that the wind tugged free from the tangled rose bushes. I sipped the last of the lukewarm coffee from this morning, the mug chipped at the rim, familiar in my hands like an old bruise I'd stopped covering up. I thought about Lydia then, not about the house or the forged signatures or the marble counters scrubbed clean of my name. I thought about her the way she'd been before, 17, hair still dark and wild, sitting cross-legged at the foot of my bed when I had the flu, reading to me from Dad's battered old Stephen King paperbacks because I'd begged her to. I could almost hear her voice, low and dramatic, every word dripping with the promise that she'd always be there. Back then, I'd believed her. I'd believed that family meant you never had to wonder if your hand would be slapped away when you reached out in the dark. A gust of wind rattled the porch rails, scattering rose petals across my lap. Jasper twitched and sniffed the air, pressing closer to my thigh like he knew I needed to feel something warm and alive. I closed my eyes and let the memory fade, pushed it back behind the new walls, the fresh wood, the open windows that smelled like wet earth and the promise of spring. This was my house now, my life. And Lydia, the version of her I'd loved, the version who'd read to me in the dark, she didn't live here anymore. When I went back inside, I clicked off the porch light. No reason to leave it burning for someone who'd never find her way to my door again. I curled up on my squeaky air mattress, Jasper a purring lump pressed against my spine. The wind carried the scent of roses through the open window, wild and untamed and alive in a way Lydia's fake hydrangeas had never been. Sleep came slow but soft. No nightmares of courtrooms or forged signatures, just the slow, steady thrum of my heartbeat, stronger than it had been in months. When I drifted under, I carried a single truth with me like a promise stitched to my ribs. Home wasn't marble floors or granite countertops or designer furniture. Home was this. Roses at the fence line. Cracked paint under my nails. A door Lydia would never darken again. Mine. I woke up before dawn the next day, the sky still the bruised color of old memories, the wild roses tapping at my window in the early breeze like they had something to say. Jasper was draped across my chest, all warm fur and sleep-heavy limbs, his tail flicking against my chin every few seconds as if reminding me, "You're still here. You're still here." In the hush, I could almost pretend the last year hadn't happened, that my veins hadn't carried poison instead of promises, that my sister hadn't carved out my future and furnished her dream house with the soft, stolen flesh of my hope. But pretending was how I got here in the first place. So I let the truth settle in the room with me. I lay there, listening to my heartbeat echo through the ribs cancer hadn't stolen yet. The old house creaked and sighed around me, every crack in the plaster a reminder that what's broken can still stand, if you choose to stand with it. I made coffee on that battered camping stove again, my breath ghosting in the cool dawn air drifting through the open kitchen window. I could smell the roses even here, sweeter now that the morning was peeling the night back layer by layer. The mug felt heavy in my hands, not because of the coffee but because of what came next. I'd spent so much time clawing back what Lydia stole that I hadn't planned for after. Tanya kept asking, "What now?" I kept saying, "I don't know," but that wasn't true, not really. I did know, I just hadn't let myself say it out loud yet. By 9, Tanya was back, arms full of more donuts, a box of fresh bagels, and a cheap spiral notebook she slammed down on my empty counter with a grin. "No more pity breakfasts on the floor," she said, flicking crumbs off her leggings as she perched on my only chair, a battered metal thing we'd found at a yard sale 2 streets over. "We're planning your life now, Cass, so spill it. What are you gonna do with all this freedom?" She gestured around the kitchen like it was some grand palace, but I could see it the way she did, the bright paint that could cover the yellowed walls, the battered cabinets that would look charming once we sanded them down and replaced the rusty hinges. A future, not Lydia's future. Mine. I slid the mug away from my lips and pulled the notebook toward me. Tanya's eyes widened when I clicked open the cheap ballpoint pen. "Oh, it's serious now?" she teased, but her voice was soft, warm. She leaned in, elbows on her knees, waiting. I flipped to a blank page, ignoring the way my fingers trembled just a little. I wrote the word at the top, big, bold, a stake driven into the ground of my new life. Home. We spent the next hour filling the page. Tiny things first, new locks for the back door, a fresh coat of paint for the porch steps Lydia would never stand on. A real coffee maker so Tanya would stop making fun of my camping stove espresso. A shelf for Mom's old books, the ones Lydia had boxed up and left to molder in her basement because they didn't match her curated aesthetic. Then bigger things, the roof needed work, the cracked window in the bedroom, the heater that rattled like it was dying every time I turned it on. None of it felt heavy the way marble counters did. None of it tasted like fraud in my mouth. Every word I wrote made me feel lighter, like the house and I were rebuilding each other, one scribbled line at a time. When we ran out of pages, Tanya ripped the list out of the notebook and slapped it against my chest. "Call the plumber today," she ordered, "and the roofer, and maybe a real contractor for that porch. I'll help you paint when you're ready, but I'm not climbing up on your roof. I have limits." I laughed, really laughed, the kind that felt like it started somewhere deep in my lungs where chemo used to live. Jasper jumped at the sound and shot under the table, his tail bottle brushed in protest. When I caught my breath, Tanya squeezed my shoulder. "You're really doing this, Cass." I looked around at the cracked paint, the uneven floorboards, the roses clawing at the window. "Yeah," I said, "I really am." That afternoon, after Tanya left for a quick run home to shower and change, I sat on the porch steps with my phone balanced on my knee. The list was propped up beside me, fluttering in the breeze. I dialed the first plumber on the list Tanya had scribbled for me. My voice shook a little when I explained the leak, the old pipes, the heater that moaned in the night like a ghost I hadn't made peace with yet. But I got through it. Scheduled the visit, wrote down the time on the back of a takeout receipt. It felt small, so small. But for me, it was the biggest thing I'd done in a long time that didn't come with a bill marked urgent or past due in red ink. I spent the rest of the afternoon pulling weeds in the yard. I didn't know what I was doing. My hands got scratched raw by the thorns, dirt ground into the beds of my nails. Jasper watched me from the window, his tail flicking like he was judging my technique. By the time the sun dipped behind the row of tired maples lining the street, my knees were caked with dirt. My hair stuck to my forehead with sweat, and a neat little pile of dead weeds sat at the edge of the cracked walkway. It didn't look like much, but the roses looked happier, like they could breathe now that the tangled mess around their roots was gone. Inside, I cleaned up with the water that still sputtered from the bathroom tap like it was deciding whether it trusted me yet. I toweled my hair dry, pulled on my softest sweatshirt, the one I'd worn to my final chemo session, the one Lydia had laughed at because it was so threadbare. It still smelled like cheap detergent and old hope. I made myself a peanut butter sandwich, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor while Jasper batted at the crusts. It wasn't Lydia's catered spread or her marble breakfast island piled with fresh berries and imported cheese, but it was mine. It tasted better for that. That night, as I lay on the air mattress with Jasper purring at my side, I scrolled through old messages on my phone, Lydia's voicemails, the ones I hadn't deleted yet. I pressed play on the oldest one, my thumb hovering over the screen as her syrupy voice filled the quiet room. "Cass, it's me, pick up, okay? I know you're upset, but you don't understand. It was for the best, for both of us. You can't fight this alone, you need me, you always have. Call me back, okay? Please, Cass, please." I let it play to the end, then hit delete. One by one, 42 voicemails, 42 tiny hooks she'd left in my skin. Each one gone, each one a small mercy, a small act of rebellion, a small reclaiming. Outside the window, the roses rustled in the wind like they were whispering secrets to the night. I pressed my palm to the wall beside my head and let the warmth of it anchor me. Tomorrow the plumber would come, the day after that maybe the roofer, then paint, then shelves, then a couch that didn't smell like stale betrayal. And someday soon, this house wouldn't feel like a fortress built against Lydia's ghost. It would feel like home. Mine. The plumber showed up right on time the next morning, a stocky guy named Rick with rough hands and tired eyes. He knocked on my half-painted front door while I was still scraping dried peanut butter off a chipped plate in the sink. Jasper took one look at him, hissed like he'd been personally offended, and bolted under the couch I'd dragged in off a neighbor's curb just 2 days earlier. Rick stepped inside like he was afraid the whole house might fall down around him. He took off his muddy boots at the door, tucked them neatly by the mat, a small kindness that made something soft settle under my ribs. He barely said a word while he poked around under the sink and knocked on pipes like they were old bones that could confess secrets. I hovered in the doorway, arms crossed over my chest, watching him work. His presence filled the kitchen in a way that made it feel less empty, like maybe this cracked old place really could be fixed with enough patience and sweat. Every time he asked me a question, it was gentle, like he knew I wasn't just repairing a leak. Like he could hear the echo of Lydia's voice still rattling around these walls, whispering that nothing I built would ever be mine. When Rick finished, he wiped his hands on a rag that looked older than my couch and scribbled the bill on a scrap of yellow paper. "Should hold for a while," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Might want to get those pipes fully replaced someday, but they'll last you through the winter." He didn't look at me like I was a charity case. He didn't look at me like a headline or a victim or the fool sister of the local scandal. He just looked at me like a woman standing in her own kitchen, trying to hold her life together one drip at a time. When I paid him, he didn't flinch at the folded bills I pulled from the envelope Tanya had helped me set aside for repairs. He just tucked them in his pocket and tipped his head at Jasper's glaring eyes peeking from under the couch. "Looks like he'll keep you honest," Rick said with a half smile. I laughed. It startled me how easy it came, how real it felt. "Yeah, he does." After he left, I sat on the floor beside the kitchen sink, my knees pulled to my chest. I pressed my palm against the cabinet door like I could feel the pipes humming inside, like I could feel my house taking a deeper breath. For so long, my life had been a cycle of patching leaks Lydia left behind. Now, for the first time, it felt like fixing something wasn't just delaying the flood. It was building something that could hold. Tanya showed up 2 hours later with paint samples fanned out like a deck of tarot cards. She barged in without knocking, arms full of cheap drop cloths and the second cheapest brushes the hardware store sold. "Pick a color," she said, plopping down on the living room floor where the sun spilled in through the cracked window. "No more excuses, this is happening today." I knelt beside her, Jasper hopping into my lap like he wanted to be part of the vote. The colors looked the same at first: soft creams, warm whites, a pale blue that made me think of the cheap Afghan Mom used to drape over our shoulders on cold nights. I hovered my finger over that blue. Tanya watched my face, her grin blooming slow and wide. "Yeah?" she asked. I nodded, "Yeah." We spent the afternoon covering the old walls. We scraped away flacking paint, spackled little holes where time or Lydia's memory had tried to burrow in. Tanya balanced on a borrowed ladder while I did the baseboards, paint dripping on my hands and forearms until I looked like I'd dipped myself in frost. We didn't talk about Lydia, didn't talk about what came next. We just moved to the hum of the old radio Tanya dragged in, an ancient thing that only picked up one static-heavy station playing soft rock and scratchy news bulletins about community yard sales and local church bake-offs. It felt right, the normalcy of it. The small, good hum of voices that didn't know my name, didn't care about my story. When we finished the last coat just before dusk, Tanya collapsed on the floor with a groan, her paint-smeared wrist draped dramatically over her eyes. "We are never doing that again," she announced to the cracked ceiling. I dropped beside her, back pressed against the fresh wall, the color soft and calming like the memory of Mom's old blanket. Jasper immediately climbed onto Tanya's stomach, kneading her hoodie like she was just another warm piece of this house he'd claimed. I looked around at the room, still empty of furniture except for my junk store couch and the battered coffee table we'd rescued from the curb. But with the new paint catching the last light, it felt warmer, brighter, possible. Tanya cracked an eye open at me, her voice soft. "Feels different, huh?" I nodded, "Yeah, feels like mine." She reached over and flicked a blob of paint from my cheek. "It is yours, Cass, finally." When Tanya left that night, she pressed her forehead to mine at the door like we were teenagers again, like the years between the girls we'd been and the women we'd become hadn't swallowed us whole for a while. "Call me if you need anything," she said, voice fierce. "Anything, plumber, painter, another ladder when this one collapses and kills us both, you call me." I laughed, my throat tight. "I know." She pulled back, eyes searching mine. "And Cass, this doesn't end with a painted wall, you know that, right?" I nodded, "I know." After she left, I didn't rush to clean up the mess, the drop cloths, the brushes soaking in the sink, the faint paint smears on my bare feet where I'd stepped through a tray without noticing. I left it all, let it linger like proof. I curled up on the old couch, Jasper draped over my hip, his rumbling purr echoing in the fresh, soft blue air. Outside, the roses whispered at the window like they were pressing close to listen. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to a fresh note, and tapped out the next line on my home list: bookshelf, lamps, curtains that don't look like hospital drapes. Little things, ordinary things, the kind of future Lydia's marble palace never made room for. I thought about her then, wherever she was. Maybe tucked away in some cheap hotel room, spinning her next story for someone else to swallow whole. Maybe staring at some new, unsuspecting friend, that same soft, poisonous smile playing at her lips. I wondered if she ever thought about me, If she could see this house in her mind, the cracked walls she'd sneered at now warm with fresh paint and soft light. If she could picture me here, barefoot, hair a mess, Jasper purring his stubborn hymn into the dark. Did she hate it? Did she wish she could stand at my door again, her lies clutched to her chest like pearls she'd pretend to drop at my feet? It didn't matter anymore. I pressed my palm to the wall behind my head. The paint was dry now, smooth, cool under my skin. It felt like the start of something not perfect but honest. The kind of truth you could touch without drawing blood. I closed my eyes, Jasper's purr vibrating through my bones, and let myself believe it. This house wasn't just a shield against Lydia's ghost. It was a promise. Mine. By the end of the week, the house smelled like fresh paint and old roses and something new I couldn't quite name yet, a clean promise maybe, or just the soft breath of a life that finally felt like it was mine. The plumber's fix held steady. The roofer came 2 days later, a quiet older man named Mel who whistled tunelessly while he shuffled around my sagging shingles, mumbling under his breath about weather and rot and should have been done years ago. He didn't ask who'd owned the house before me. He didn't ask where the money came from or why I flinched when he handed me the estimate. He just did the work. And when he was done, he tipped his cap, scratched Jasper's head when the cat dared venture onto the porch, and drove off without another word. The quiet in the house afterwards felt different. Not empty, not like the cavernous echo of Lydia's stolen mansion, all marble and silence. This quiet was earned. Soft. The way a deep exhale feels after you've been holding your breath for too long. I made myself instant ramen for dinner that night. The good kind Tanya swore was garbage, but I'd loved since college, salty and warm and perfect, eaten cross-legged on the floor. I set the bowl on an overturned crate I was using as a table for now, the steam rising up into the newly painted air. Jasper watched every bite like he was daring me to drop a noodle. When I was done, I stacked the bowl in the sink, another small promise to myself. Tomorrow I'd buy a real table. A second-hand one, maybe something solid, something with scratches and dents that told a story. Nothing that gleamed like Lydia's dining set, all cold shine and matching candlesticks nobody ever lit. Later, when the house was dark except for the cheap lamp Tanya had lent me, I sat on my battered couch with the old notebook in my lap, flipping through the home list. I'd crossed off plumber and roof. I circled paint twice just to feel the weight of that finished line. But further down the page, past bookshelf and curtains, there were words that made my pen hesitate: job, treatment plan, future. The big things, the things Lydia's betrayal had stolen twice over, once with the money, and once with the lie that I couldn't rebuild any of it without her. I set the pen down, pressed my fingertips to the paper until the ridges of the letters pressed back. It would have been so easy to stay in the shallow end, to keep painting walls and fixing pipes and pretending the rest didn't exist. But the cancer didn't care about fresh paint. The hospital didn't care about rose bushes and new locks. The fear that still woke me up at 3 a.m., the terror that my next scan would be worse than the last, that was the part Lydia's money was never going to fix. I needed a plan, a real one. The next morning, I called Dr. Havorson's office. I hadn't spoken to her since I'd fired off the email telling her I couldn't afford the last round of immunotherapy. My hands shook so badly I dropped the phone twice before I finally pressed call. The receptionist's voice was calm, too calm, like she knew I might hang up if she sounded too sympathetic. She gave me a new appointment 2 weeks out. Said they'd figure out the billing later. I hung up before my throat could close, before the tears could come and make it feel like I was 16 again, waiting for Lydia to show up at Mom's old sedan after my first chemo round, all soft promises and stolen hope. I didn't tell Tanya about the appointment right away. She showed up that afternoon with arms full of plastic bags, groceries this time, cheap canned soup, a dented box of tea bags, fresh bread from the corner bakery. She dumped everything on my new second-hand table like it was an offering to the house. "You need real food," she scolded, waving off my protests that ramen was technically real food. "You're not surviving this just to eat yourself back into a hospital bed, Cass." She didn't mean it cruelly. Her voice cracked halfway through. She pushed a box of stale cookies into my hands and made me promise to eat one with my tea later. I promised. She knew I would. She knew I lied badly. That night I did eat the cookies, stale or not. I brewed the tea and sat on my new old chair at my new old table, Jasper perched on the windowsill behind me, tail flicking at the wild roses brushing the screen. I thought about Lydia then, not the sister in the marble kitchen, but the girl who used to sit at our plastic breakfast table and break her toast in half to share with me when we didn't have enough. I wondered if she ever missed that girl, the one she'd gutted to build the version that smiled so pretty on my stolen money. I wondered if there was any part of her left that would see me now, bruised, exhausted, eating stale cookies at a table bought with the scraps of her mess, and feel something like regret. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. It didn't change anything. 2 weeks later, Tanya drove me to the clinic. The appointment wasn't easy. It never was. Dr. Halvorson's eyes were kind in a way that made my throat hurt. She didn't talk about Lydia. She didn't ask how I'd scraped the money back together. She just talked about options, about next steps, about new trials I might qualify for now that I wasn't buried under stolen debt. It was terrifying and freeing to realize I could say yes or no all by myself. Lydia's signature wasn't on any of these forms, just mine, just my name in my own shaky handwriting. When we got back to the house, Tanya didn't ask what the doctor had said. She just made me tea, unwrapped a day-old muffin from the bakery, and sat on the porch with me while Jasper hunted dust motes in the slanting light. We didn't talk about the future like it was a promise Lydia could break again. We just sat there, two women breathing in the roses, the cracked wood beneath us warm from the sun. Before she left that night, Tanya turned to me in the doorway, her eyes bright under the porch light I'd finally fixed. "You're doing it, Cass," she said. "You're really doing it." I looked past her shoulder at the yard, at the wild roses climbing the fence, at the porch step that didn't sag anymore, at the living room lamp glowing through the window like a heartbeat I could see. "Yeah," I said, "I really am." And this time, when I closed the door behind her, I didn't look for Lydia's shadow on the other side. I turned off the porch light not because I was afraid of who might find their way to my door, but because for the first time, I knew no one would come here unless I opened the door for them. This house wasn't a hiding place anymore. It was mine. It was raining when I woke up the next morning, a soft, steady drizzle tapping the old window panes like a lullaby. I lay still for a while on my squeaky air mattress, listening to Jasper's purr rumble against my ribs, the rain mingling with the creak of the old heater that Rick had patched just enough to limp through another season. I thought about Lydia, not the glamorous ghost that haunted my bank account or the sister in the news blurbs that still popped up when I wasn't careful enough with my searches. I thought about the girl who used to love the rain, how she'd stand barefoot on our childhood porch in Mom's oversized sweater, arms stretched wide, hair soaked through. She'd drag me out with her until I was shivering and giggling, and we'd sit on the steps, puddles pooling under our thighs, daring each other to catch lightning on our tongues. I wondered if she remembered that girl now, if she ever stood at some tinted hotel window, watching the storm roll by, pretending she couldn't see the reflection of what she'd become. I shook the thought away. Outside my window, the roses drooped heavy with the weight of the rain, petals shivering with each drop. They were beautiful like this, bent, battered, but refusing to snap. I sat up, nudging Jasper aside so I could swing my legs over the edge of the mattress. He flopped dramatically onto his side as if I'd ruined the best nap of his life. His tail flicked against my ankle like a promise, I'm still here. I made coffee on my new second-hand machine, a battered thing I'd found for $15 at a yard sale 2 streets over. It sputtered and gurgled like it might die at any moment, but it filled the kitchen with warmth that tasted like something earned, not stolen. I drank it standing at the window, watching the roses drip and shiver. My notebook sat open on the counter, the home list spread out in black ink. Most of the practical things were crossed off now, the roof, the pipes, the paint. There were new curtains in the bedroom, soft blue ones that fluttered when I cracked the window to let the breeze in at night. There was a battered bookshelf I'd dragged in from a thrift store, its shelves lined with Mom's old paperbacks, their yellowed pages smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. But there was one line at the bottom of the list I kept circling, my pen hovering, then pulling away. Next. I didn't know what next looked like. For so long, next had meant chemo appointments, Lydia's voicemails, court dates, and signatures that weren't mine. Now the house was whole, or as whole as an old place like this could ever be. And my body, My body was still a question mark, a map with roads I hadn't dared walk yet. But next was waiting for me. It always would be, whether I was ready or not. That afternoon, when the rain finally slowed, I pulled on my oldest jeans and my ratty sweatshirt, the one that still smelled like the hospital waiting room, and went outside. The roses needed trimming. I'd been putting it off, afraid to snip too much, afraid I'd kill what I was trying to keep alive. I found Mom's old garden shears in the cardboard box I hadn't unpacked yet. The handles were chipped, the blades speckled with rust. But they felt solid in my hand, familiar in a way Lydia's polished silver would never be. I knelt in the wet grass, knees soaking through, and started with the dead stems first, the brittle ones that cracked under the slightest touch. I worked slowly, the rhythm of it steadying my breath, my thoughts. Every snip felt like a tiny release, a piece of rot gone, a space made for something new to bloom. Jasper watched from the porch, tail flicking back and forth like a metronome, keeping time with my heartbeat. By the time I finished, my palms were scratched and pink, my legs numb from kneeling. But when I stepped back, the roses looked lighter, less burdened by what they couldn't carry anymore. I sat back on my heels, the rain starting up again, soft and sweet against my face. I let it fall, didn't run inside, didn't flinch at the damp chill creeping under my collar. I just breathed and watched the petals bow and sway, alive and dripping but rooted deep. Inside, I toweled off in the doorway. Jasper meowed his disapproval, circling my ankles like he could dry me off with sheer annoyance. I made another cup of coffee, bitter this time, but it didn't matter. It was mine. I curled up on the couch, notebook in my lap. The pages were speckled with tiny raindrops from where I'd carried it outside, kneading it near me like an anchor. I flipped to a clean page and wrote it at the top, the word that had been hovering like a ghost behind every scraped baseboard and patched pipe. Work. The money Lydia had stolen, the chunk the courts forced her to pay back, the rest scraped together from the sale of her mansion, it wouldn't last forever. Not with medical bills, groceries, property taxes, surprise roof leaks waiting in the wings. I couldn't hide behind my walls forever, I didn't want to. I spent the next hour scribbling ideas. Paralegal work again? Maybe, but the thought made my stomach twist. That world still smelled like Lydia's perfume, sharp and cold in the back of my throat. Freelance? Maybe. I'd always been good with words. I could edit, draft, ghostwrite. Or maybe I'd pick up something small at the local bakery Tanya loved, warm, simple, cash under the counter for mornings spent rolling dough and listening to old ladies gossip over stale donuts. Every option scared me. Every option tasted like freedom too. When Tanya dropped by that evening, unannounced, as usual, I showed her the page. She didn't laugh, didn't scoff at my half-baked plan to maybe bake bread for strangers while I figured out the rest of my life. She just sat beside me on the couch, Jasper wedged between us like a furry referee, and said, "It doesn't have to be forever, Cass, just something to get you out there again, to remind you this is yours now, not hers." I nodded, pressing my pen to the margin where I'd doodled tiny roses. Yeah, I know. The next morning, I walked down to the bakery. Tanya's friend Marisol owned it, a squat brick building that smelled like warm sugar and fresh coffee before you even stepped inside. Marisol didn't ask for a resume. She didn't ask about Lydia or the house or the money or the whispers that still clung to my name like stray thorns. She just handed me an apron, pointed to the back where the day-old bread was bagged for donation, and said, "You start tomorrow." I walked home with a bag of still warm rolls tucked under my arm, the rain misting against my face like a blessing instead of a burden. I could see my house at the end of the block, my chipped porch steps, my soft blue curtains fluttering in the open window, my wild roses dancing in the breeze like they knew I was coming back. I thought of Lydia then, not her voice, not her cruelty, but the truth she'd left behind when she fled the mess she'd made. I didn't need her to survive. I didn't need her to build something that was mine. She stolen my future once, carved it up and sold it like marble countertops and gold faucets. But she hadn't stolen this. I stepped onto my porch, set the bread down by the door, and turned to watch the street. The rain fell softer now, a whisper instead of a warning. Jasper pressed his nose against the window, meowing for me to hurry up and feed him. I laughed, really laughed, the sound echoing down the street like a promise stitched to my ribs. I had a house. I had a plan. I had tomorrow. And Lydia, she had none of this. Mine. The bell above the bakery door chimed like a soft welcome when I stepped inside my first morning. I thought I'd be nervous. I'd imagine my hands trembling, my voice catching when someone asked for extra sugar or a cup of drip coffee. But the moment I walked in, the warmth swallowed me whole. The clatter of metal trays, the hiss of the espresso machine, Marisol humming under her breath while she dusted cinnamon over fresh sticky buns. It was so normal, so wonderfully ordinary, that the fear dissolved like sugar in hot tea. Marisol handed me a clean apron and pointed me to the back counter where day-old loaves were lined up for bagging. "Start with these," she said, flicking flour off her wrist. "And if you don't mess that up, I'll show you the register." It was the first job I'd ever had that didn't require a degree or a resume or Lydia's name scribbled on the reference line. Nobody cared here about my last name, or the stolen money, or the way strangers still sometimes stared when they recognized me from that article or the local news clip. Here, all that mattered was the bread, soft, warm, fragrant, the customers, the gentle ring of the till as it opened and closed, the shuffle of bills, the clink of change. I fell into the rhythm fast, faster than I expected. Bag the loaves, tie them tight, stack them by the back door for the church volunteers to pick up, wipe down the flour-dusted counter, restock the napkins, smile when the regulars shuffled in, rain-soaked umbrellas dripping on the floor. Tanya showed up halfway through my shift, hair pulled into a lopsided bun, phone wedged between her shoulder and her ear as she ordered 2 muffins and an iced coffee she'd never finish. She leaned across the counter while Marisol rang her up, eyes bright with mischief. "Look at you, Cass, working girl, you've got flour in your hair, by the way." I swatted at my bangs, grinning. "It's part of the uniform." Marisol snorted. "It's true, you should see me by closing. I look like I wrestled a bag of flour and lost." Tanya left with her muffins and a wink, calling over her shoulder, "Dinner tonight, my place, no excuses." I didn't argue, I didn't feel the need to. The old Cass, the Cass Lydia built, would have made an excuse. Would have stayed home, hidden behind cracked blinds, counting pennies and pain like penance for someone else's crime. This Cass, she tied her apron tighter, brushed flour from her face, and turned back to the next customer like she belonged exactly where she was. By the end of my shift, my feet ached in that good way, the way they used to after Mom dragged me to church bake sales, and I'd spend hours selling pies next to Lydia's perfect, spotless smile. I washed my hands in the back sink until the smell of sugar and yeast clung to my skin like an old promise. Marisol pressed a paper bag into my hands as I slipped off my apron, leftover scones, a chunk of still warm sourdough, a fist-sized cookie she claimed was too ugly to sell. "For you and the beast," she said, jerking her chin toward the door like Jasper might be waiting out there, sharpening his claws on her stoop. I laughed. "He'll love you forever for this. Then he's the only man I want in my life right now." Outside, the sky was clear for once, the storm clouds finally drifting off to pester someone else's roses for a while. I walked home slow, the paper bag crinkling under my arm, the late sun warm on my neck. When I turned the corner onto my street, I saw my porch before I saw the house, those cracked steps, the flacking paint we'd never finished, the roses climbing the railings like they were reaching for my door. For a heartbeat, it looked like a postcard from the life Lydia promised me, the life she promised she'd protect if only I'd sign it all over to her. But when I blinked, all I saw was mine. Not perfect, not polished, not marble and gold. Just mine. I found Jasper in the front window, tail flicking like a metronome the second he spotted the paper bag. By the time I'd wrestled the key into the sticky old lock, he was at my feet, mewling like I hadn't fed him that morning. I tore off a corner of the scone and set it in his dish. He sniffed it once, then shot me a glare that said, "This is not the tuna you owe me," before slinking off to glare at me from the windowsill instead. That night, Tanya made pasta in her tiny apartment 2 streets over, the kind you buy frozen in a bag and try to pass off as homemade if you squint. She poured us cheap wine into mismatched mugs because she'd broken the last of her good glasses last week. We ate cross-legged on her couch, the TV muttering some reality show in the background. It was simple, it was small, it was real. Halfway through her second mug of wine, Tanya nudged my knee with hers. "So, how's it feel?" I knew what she meant. I stared at the rim of my mug, the tiny chip where the glaze had worn away. Like I'm not pretending anymore, I said. Tanya grinned. Good. She pointed her fork at me. Don't you dare stop now. When I got home later, the street was quiet. The roses were dark shapes in the moonlight, heavy with dew, nodding their soft heads toward the porch like they were standing guard. Inside, Jasper curled around my ankles as I locked the door. I stepped over the pile of unpacked boxes in the hall, the ones I'd told myself I'd deal with tomorrow every day for weeks. Tonight felt like a good night to stop waiting. I dragged the first box to the living room, tearing the tape open with my thumbnail. Inside, old books. Half of them Mom's, half ones I'd bought with Lydia's money years ago, novels I'd pretended to love to look smart at her dinner parties. I set those aside, stacked them by the door for the library donation bin. The others, the real ones, the ones that still smelled like Mom's cigarette smoke and cheap coffee, I stacked carefully on the bookshelf Tanya and I had rescued from a neighbor's yard. I did the same with the next box and the next. Old photos, knickknacks. The teacup Mom had kept on her bedside table for years, the one Lydia had called junk and tried to throw away after the funeral. I set it on the shelf next to a battered candle and a cracked vase with no flowers in it yet. By the time I stopped, the living room looked less like a half-finished project and more like a home. Not Lydia's home, mine. When I crawled into bed hours later, Jasper curled tight against my hip. I felt the smallest piece of something settle into place. Not healed, not finished, but rooted. And sometimes that was enough. The next morning, Marisol put me on the register. My hands shook a little the first time I counted back change, old habits from a life where every penny counted, every signature meant another piece of myself signed away. But by the third customer, the routine felt like breathing. An elderly woman with hair the color of snow tapped the counter with her cane while I bagged her sticky bun. "You're Lydia Barnes' sister, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp enough to slice. I froze just for a second, long enough for my heart to kick at my ribs like it wanted out. Then I set the bag in front of her, forced my hands to steady. "Not anymore," I said, "just Cass." The old woman squinted at me, then nodded once. "Good, she never did belong here, you know." She tapped her cane again and shuffled out into the morning sun. I stood there a moment, the smell of cinnamon and fresh coffee swirling around me like an old song with new words. Marisol caught my eye from the kitchen door, one eyebrow arched. I just laughed. "What?" I called. She shrugged. "Nothing, just nice to see you standing up straight." When my shift ended, I walked home slow, Jasper's treat, a leftover muffin, tucked in my pocket. The roses were waiting when I turned the corner, nodding their soft heads at me like they knew. Not perfect, not polished. Just mine. The bakery felt like home faster than I'd expected. By the end of the first month, my hands smelled faintly of dough and sugar even after 3 showers. I knew how to refill the espresso machine without flooding the counter, how to time the register drawer so it never slammed shut too loud, and startled Mrs. Gordon, the old woman with the snow-white hair who'd first recognized me as Lydia's sister, then decided that Cass was good enough on her own. Marisol trusted me enough to open alone on Tuesdays. I liked those mornings best, the quiet before dawn, the street still sleeping while I flicked on the neon open sign. The warmth of the ovens, the first swirl of cinnamon in the air, the soft thud of flour bags being dragged across the floor. I'd stand behind the counter, watching the first streaks of sun slip through the fogged glass, and think, this is what a life feels like when it's yours. At home, the roses bloomed too early that spring, bright, stubborn bursts of pink and red that tumbled over the fence like they didn't know they were supposed to wait for warmer days. I spent weekends in the yard, knees muddy, fingers pricked raw from trimming back dead branches and pulling weeds that clawed at the roots. Jasper followed me from window to window as I worked. He'd sit on the porch rail, tail flicking, as if he were personally supervising my progress. Every so often, he'd yowl at a passing bird, then glare at me for not doing something about it. Tanya came over on Sundays with bags of groceries I pretended I didn't need, fresh produce, cheap wine, the good kind of butter she insisted made everything taste like hope. We'd sit on my couch, our feet propped on the battered coffee table she'd helped me drag in from the curb months ago, and we'd talk about nothing and everything. Sometimes she'd catch me staring out the window, at the roses, at the cracked porch steps, at the life blooming in the quiet corners Lydia's shadow used to fill. She never asked if I missed my sister, she didn't have to. One Thursday morning, I got a letter, the kind that made my chest clench the moment I saw the return address. The courthouse, one last piece of the mess Lydia had left behind, clawing at my doorstep like an old ghost. I carried it to the kitchen table, my table, and sat in the same chair where I'd once scribbled my home list on the back of an envelope. Jasper jumped up beside me, pressing his head to my arm until I scratched the soft spot under his chin. The letter was short, official, a final notice that Lydia's appeal had been thrown out. No more delays, no more wriggling through loopholes with that serpentine grin and her $1,000 heels. The last check, the remainder of what the court ordered her to pay, would be deposited within 30 days. 30 days. And then it would really be over. I didn't know what to do with the relief when it hit me, a hot rush under my ribs that made my vision blur, my palms sweat. For so long, the fight had been my shadow, the debt, the anger, the endless swirl of what if she comes back. Now the question that pulsed in my mind was softer, terrifying in its simplicity. What if she does? What if this was it? I thought I'd cry, I didn't. Instead, I laughed, a sharp, startled sound that made Jasper bolt from the table, tail high, offended. I buried my face in my hands, the letter crumpling between my fingers like a dead leaf. That night, Tanya found me in the garden, pruning the roses under the porch light, sweat-damp hair sticking to my neck. She didn't say anything when I pressed the letter into her hands. She read it in silence, then folded it back along the original crease and slid it into my pocket like it was nothing more than a receipt for something I'd already paid for in full. So, she said, brushing a thorn from my sleeve, what now? What now? I looked at the house, the soft blue paint we'd slathered on that first weekend, the windows warm with the glow of my battered thrift store lamps, the shape of Jasper's silhouette in the window, tail flicking like a metronome. I thought about Mom's old teacup on my shelf, the hospital bills now neatly filed and paid one by one, the stack of medical forms on my kitchen counter, the next step of treatment I'd chosen for myself with my own signature, my own say. I thought about Lydia, somewhere out there, her name still a knife in certain circles, but duller now, blunted by her own greed, her own choices. She had taken so much. And still here I was. Now, I said, glancing at Tanya, the laughter bubbling up in my throat like something carbonated and alive. Now I live here, I said, I really actually live here. We sat on the porch steps until the roses nodded off under the night sky, the air buzzing with crickets and the distant hum of cars on the main road. Tanya leaned her head on my shoulder, her breathing soft and steady. We didn't talk about Lydia again that night, or ever really. Some ghosts didn't need banishing, they just needed to be left behind. When Tanya finally went home, I stayed out there a while longer, toes curling in the cool dirt under the steps. I looked at my house, really looked at it. Not the peeling paint or the sagging porch rail I'd have to replace come summer. Not the cracked window I'd taped over until I could afford real glass. Not the spots where Lydia's laughter still lingered in the floorboards if I let my mind wander too far. I looked at the light spilling through the living room curtains, the battered bookshelf lined with dog-eared paperbacks, the shape of Jasper curled on the back of my couch like he owned the place more than I did. I looked at all of it and thought, mine. The next morning, I woke up to birdsong and the scent of roses drifting through my cracked window. I lay there a while, staring at the ceiling, my hand resting on Jasper's warm back as he snored against my ribs. I didn't think about Lydia. I thought about the bakery, about Mrs. Gordon, who'd promised to bring me one of her crocheted tea cozies because you look like the kind of girl who needs one. About Marisol's laugh as she flicked powdered sugar at me when I missed a tray of muffins in the oven. About Tanya, who'd probably show up unannounced tonight with a bag of oranges and some half-baked plan for repainting the fence. I thought about the roses, how they bloomed too soon but never seemed to mind the cold. I thought about the next step in my treatment, the one I'd chosen, the one I would face come what may on my own terms. I thought about all the tiny things Lydia could never steal, no matter how hard she tried. My hands, my laughter, the warmth of my porch steps under a spring sun, the taste of cheap wine with a friend who never flinched at my scars. When I finally got up, I found Jasper pawing at the front door, tail high, demanding the porch be opened so he could sniff every single flower like it was his birthright. I made a mug of cheap instant coffee, the good kind, the kind I liked, not the imported nonsense Lydia used to serve with a sneer. I stood barefoot on the porch, mug warm between my palms, Jasper prowling the rail like a tiny king. The roses nodded in the breeze, heavy with new buds I'd trim next weekend. Or maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I'd let them bloom wild for a while, stubborn, bright, impossible to ignore. I sipped my coffee, let the sun find my face, and said it out loud, to the roses, to the porch, to the ghost of my sister who would never again cross this threshold. Mine. And it was. It always would be.